meeting to the cloud?
Probably wait a few more minutes for some of the other folks.
Yeah. Looks like another SIG is logged in with their SIG account. What I discovered is that if you're on Zoom, even if you're logged in on the app on your personal account, if you've logged in on the web with a different account, it will switch to that when you start up Zoom. So you need to log out on both your app and on your and in your browser to be able to get back to your original user. If anyone else has been running into that.
Yeah.
Yes,
I think it might help on the account for this SIG. I think you can create calendar entries inside Zoom that make it easier to start this up the next time.
Yeah. Oh, no, yeah, this was more the, I just needed the host key. Yeah, the Zoom entry for it was fine. But, yeah, I guess we can probably just get started now. I've dropped a link to the Google Doc into the Zoom chat. If everyone can't see that, let me know and I'll drop it in again. And here we go. So on the agenda, Nishi was supposed to go first, but it looks like she hasn't arrived quite yet on the update for the steering committee proposal for consolidating provider SIGs. So why don't we put that on the back burner until she shows up, and we'll move down to the next item, which is Andrew for using the cloud provider repository for tracking SIG efforts.
Yeah, so this is a new thing I'm trying. There's a lot of issues in the core Kubernetes repo. There's just a lot of issues there related to our SIG that we have kind of ignored just because like it's just a big mess that no one's willing to kind of go through. So one thing I'm doing right now is going through the backlog, cleaning it up a bit, trying to summarize those issues, and then kind of backporting them into the cloud provider repository. And so I think the main motivation for me doing this is that I think it'll help us kind of categorize milestones for the next releases coming up. So I have two milestones. So I kind of copied this from SIG cluster lifecycle. So there's going to be two milestones next, and the next and one dot whatever version is coming out for Kubernetes. And so this is, I guess the goal here is to try to narrow down and focus more on what are the top priorities for the upcoming Kubernetes version. So I'm still going through this. There's a few more issues that I need to migrate here, but I think it's a bit too late to do this for 114, but definitely for 115, I'd like to kind of do more planning sessions and go through the backlog of issues we have here and try to come up with, or at least set those milestones together as a SIG, and then we can kind of know what to execute on for those upcoming versions. Anyone have thoughts or objections to doing this?
So I think it's a great idea. I think, so I'm kind of corralling an effort around horizontal SIGs and doing project grooming, project board grooming. So what do you think of also having an org level project board for this?
Yeah, I saw your post about project boards, I think yesterday. I'm okay with project boards too. Do you think it's redundant to have both project board and like issues, or do you think we should we just stick to one or do both?
Do both. Yeah, I don't think it's redundant. I think it's just a different presentation mechanism. So depending on what you're doing, it might be more useful to have one over the other.
Okay, yeah, I'd be happy to do both. Thanks.
Is there anybody, Andrew? Do you need help on any of this effort? Would it be valuable if anybody volunteered to help you out with this, or do you think that you're almost ready to have it set up for 115?
So I think I'll be able to get it set up for 115. The only places I'll need help is some of the issues require some historical context as to why certain things were done the way they were back in, I don't, like way back. So I may ping people on the issues to kind of gather that historical context. And so it would be super helpful if people are responsive on those issues. But other than that, it's just a matter of like copy pasting existing issues for now.
Okay. All right. Was there anything else on that topic that we wanted to talk about?
That's it for me.
Okay. So then we move on to Justin for credential provider extraction.
Yeah, so actually Andrew and I were talking about this on Slack. This is the other bit of cloud provider extraction, which dare not speak its name. There is, every kubelet has baked into it SDKs for Google and Amazon, ECR, and probably some others as well. I'm forgetting which ones they are. And we presumably want to get that out of the KK repo and out of kubelet. And we were trying to think of ways to do that. And I put up some very strawman ideas, but I was just trying to see whether anyone else had thought about this or had context on it. The straw person ideas I came up with were some sort of exec plugin, some sort of gRPC type plugin. Maybe we move it centrally into like something we do something we make a web type, an HTTP type call to, or maybe we have some sort of Kubernetes controller that like injects the credentials into a secret just in time or something like that. But
I kind of like some of the proposals around the exec service. I thought a little bit about the remote thing. I mean, clearly I've been doing too much poking at this. I worry a lot in really large fleets and a lot of pod launches that you'd cause a scalability bottleneck if you tried to push it out to some external remote service. I know at least on Google and AWS, and I believe OpenStack, most of the credential provider stuff just pings kind of a local service that's bound to a local loopback interface. And I'm just a little bit worried about like causing scalability bottlenecks by trying to centralize it.
that's fair.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's nice about breaking out credential providers is that the provider itself becomes more widely usable for other projects. And I know that OpenStack has talked about it, and I just pinged our channel to see if anybody has actually done work on it. The benefit of having a single, credential provider is that the cluster API can use the same code as the cloud providers themselves, and there's not a lot of copy pasta going on, which I know in the OpenStack world is happening right now.
Yeah, and I know from the ECR side, it's also kind of desirable to allow people to be able to use the credential provider without using the cloud provider. Just because you're using ECR doesn't necessarily mean you're running on AWS. So breaking that would be nice too.
Yeah, and even like we have a webhook in place too, so that you can actually also use our credential provider to hook into Kubernetes RBAC. So there's a multitude of ways that we can apply credentials, and having a unified solution would be nice. But yeah, I don't have any input.
So I think there's a lot of, I agree that there's value in being able to load a credential provider that is not the cloud provider, but that also complicates a lot of, it complicates the efforts we have going on, because like AWS, for example, it assumes that it can only load, or the provider assumes that it would only load the credential provider if the provider is set. So I guess we should probably scope the problem to know if do we want to really support this, or should we kind of draw a line somewhere and just be like, we're not going to support cross provider credentials. I don't know.
I think as a migration step, it's probably okay to say that we want to externalize these things without changing their behavior. But I think we should also think through, kind of going forward, what it means to allow multiple cloud providers to have credential extensions. That's just my opinion.
I like the using the Kubernetes API for this. Like, it would be like implementation wise, it's so much easier just to write a controller that would generate a shared secret. I don't know like what the security implications are of like all the kubelets sharing one secret for this. But I don't know, that seems like a reasonable approach for this, to me at least.
It does. I mean, it does materialize that secret, which was previously invisible, into the Kubernetes API, and we can protect it, but it is a behavioral change to do that.
Right. So how do we feel about like just extracting the credential provider as is? Just doing a straight up move to staging, and that would unblock us first for the actual cloud provider extraction, and then once we have it staged, we can start kind of redesigning what we want the credential provider to look like.
I mean, that makes a ton of sense to me. It's still going to be linked into kubelet, right?
Yeah, it would. But at least it kind of puts like, I guess like the first priority we have right now is to stage the providers, and that assumes that we would stage providers, but it would still be linked in all the same places. So like it's still progress in terms of like where the code lives, but in terms of like where it's imported, I don't expect that to change in the near term anyways. That makes sense.
So Andrew, is this just a problem for AWS, or do other cloud providers have the same issue?
For code dependency wise, I think it's just AWS. But like the general problems we have with credential provider though, and the way it just registers all of them at once is for every provider.
Okay, and the reason I ask is I think that we can maybe solve the problems independently from each other without the staging step, because the only dependency AWS credential provider has on AWS cloud provider is a big hard-coded list of regions that shouldn't exist in the first place. I probably got a little overly aggressive in this PR trying to clean things up a little bit better, but maybe if we just snip that dependency on the region list, we can kind of separate these problems into two parts and not deal with trying to like push credential provider to staging while we're trying to extract cloud provider.
So you mean, for example, in the credential provider, we would get the current region and just add it to the list? Or
yeah, effectively.
But what do we run?
Right now there's a hard-coded list of regions in the cloud provider. I have a PR somewhere, this probably isn't it, that uses the AWS SDK to fetch the regions instead of hard coding that. That hard coded list of regions is shared with the credential provider, and the credential provider needs to also get the same list of regions from the SDK. And then the current region, it kind of works around an edge case. The only way to get the current region for an instance is to read it from the metadata. We could just not do that too.
Do we read current region for the credential provider through metadata right now, or are we using only that hard-coded list?
It's part of that dependency on cloud provider.
Right, but
cloud provider has a function to get the current region from the metadata, and credential provider uses that, if I remember correctly.
Gotcha, and then it only registers the current region and not the other ones.
It registers all the regions, including the current one. The issue with the current region is if you're using an old version of Kubernetes that's compiled against an old version of the AWS SDK, and you try to launch your cluster into a new region that AWS has added since that version of the SDK, the credential provider will fail because it doesn't know about that region. So by reading the region from the metadata and just adding that, we kind of work around it with kind of a big hammer solution, in my opinion.
And we could also get the list of regions from the SDK, right? That would also work. The challenge is like making any call to metadata or to the AWS SDK and potentially doing that call on something which is not AWS. Right?
Right. And So like, if you're saying that, like, yeah, so Jordan's problem with the PR was that we would be doing the network and file calls to like in the credential provider in a bunch of other components that would never need it, or in a kubelet that would never run the AWS provider. So like, Mike, what you're saying is that to remove the current region check altogether and just register all the regions, but is the edge case of running a Kubernetes cluster in a new region not going to be a problem for that?
That edge case is still going to exist. It's just going to fail in this case. I think there might be. I think there might be another issue too, in that there's some assumption that we're calling the metadata service. The latest version of this patch doesn't do that anymore. It does some really lightweight sys reads to determine if you even look like AWS, and if you don't, it skips all of that. So I don't think we're doing anything Jordan was objecting to anymore anyhow. The total overhead of this on a non-AWS instance is at most 3 reads into the sys file system, and then we skip it.
Okay, so it seems like we should at least raise that with Jordan again to see if if checking the virtual file system is okay, and if not, then I think we still need to have a discussion around how we're going to work around this for now.
Yeah, if we're checking the virtual file system is okay, I think that's the only blocker to shipping this and just not worrying about this at all.
Okay, because we have to address this eventually with the kubelet. So like, that's why I'm okay to like hash out the details now and at least kick off a long-term solution so that we don't work on this like as a very last thing. Okay, I guess. Yeah, okay, so I guess follow up with Jordan and then maybe follow up with Jordan and then let's have why don't we chat offline on Slack and see what the other options are.
Yeah, I'm all in favor of trying to refactor this and extract it, but I kind of would like to snip the dependencies and move forward with cloud provider before we spend too much time on this. Just my opinion.
Yeah, agreed. Okay. All right, so yeah, we'll sync up offline then.
Okay.
Cool.
On to the next topic is Andrew, Jiang, cloud provider labels.
Nishi's here actually. So.
Oh, Nishi's here now?
Yep.
Okay. Nishi, do we want to circle back around to the status update for the steering committee proposal for the changes?
Yeah, sure. And I'm so sorry for being late. Stephen, thanks for pinging me. Yeah, so this proposal, I think, is looking fairly complete now. There are some changes requested by Fabio and Stephen. Primarily, it's around how we are going to name and list these sub-projects under SIG's YAML. But basically, we all are agreeing on collapsing these SIGs as under SIG Cloud Provider and listing all the sub-projects under SIG Cloud Provider again. We will maintain the Zoom channels as is. We are just going to rename them so as to indicate to folks that the SIGs don't exist, but they exist as user groups. And I'm using the word user groups because I don't have a better word for that. And everything will continue as usual. We will try to also work with CNCF to have a user group meeting in every KubeCon. That'll continue as usual. Community updates is also one thing that we need to figure out. I think Stephen and I agree that there should be an umbrella update, but then the details of that, we can figure it out. So there are 2 or 3 areas of disagreement currently, but I think we have general agreement from everyone around the idea and the proposal. So the cloud providers will become sub-projects of SIG Cloud Provider per se. And I think that Stephen pointed out one thing. Chris, I wanted to mention this because you added certain milestones at the end of the document. the problem with making this functional, even if the steering committee agrees, is that all the CFPs have already been submitted for Shanghai and Barcelona. So the first time we can actually implement this is going to be in KubeCon North America 2019.
Right.
We should work towards that. And also, I do want to point out that even though we have brought up this release cadence discussion for out-of-tree features, again, Stephen and I agree that this should be out of scope for the cloud provider team. We figure out how to manage the release cadence from the SIG release team and then bubble it down to the cloud provider leads. But the individual provider leads will be responsible for the quality of the releases and how it happens, and we'll just roll up the update to the cloud provider lead.
Yeah, there was actually another, and I guess I probably should have included this on here too, in related to the releases. We had a meeting, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 months ago, with Tim about what we do with artifacts and how artifacts are discovered and you know, shown to users, since all of the providers are going to become externalized. You know, having a place to build and upload releases that's consistent for the providers is also going to be fairly important. And so it may be worthwhile to add a section 2 there about, you know, not only on the release cadence, but also on release artifact uploading and discovery.
So today we do the release artifacts. Whatever is released, there is a change log for each of the sub-project, and we list it out just like in tree features. Are you suggesting something different, or?
Well, a centralized, you know, location for people to find, you know, essentially builds of the releases. Like right now for OpenStack, I do a release to GitHub. I do a build and I release to the OpenStack cloud provider Git repository, and I also upload a Docker image to. It's actually I think the namespace is like, you know, cloud. You know, it's actually called like Kubernetes cloud provider. Right now, OpenStack is the only release that's happening inside of there. But, you know, if everybody's going to be releasing at the same time and pinning their releases to the Kubernetes releases, because you essentially have to, since, you know, to match up API changes, you know, having a single place where people know they can find the SIG builds that, you know, that are for their particular platform is going to be important.
So I think that is important, but it's out of scope for this proposal. I think we should try to focus on. So that's part of the reason that I said we shouldn't talk about release cadence here. It's going to be an active discussion, and it's a project-wide discussion. Same with the artifact management. There's an open kept for it if it hasn't already been merged around doing artifact management for the entire project. And I think we should let that kind of like settle out before we pick it up. I think that's going to blow the scope on this.
Okay, the other thing that I do want to add is vendors have their sort of weird behavior around this. And I say it weird because I saw it in AWS, right? The way we publish our container images for any sub-project has to be a Docker Hub that we own. And there is a security check that we do. And therefore, all our releases have to be under change logs, and then we have to own the Docker Hub where the container images are there. And there is no way that AWS will get around it. And so therefore, it's a problem that I don't even want to solve.
Okay.
What artifact is that specifically? Because if it's a community project, it should be in a community artifact management system. If we need to,
just to clarify, Stephen, so the sub-project in SIG AWS owns all the code. But if you want to deliver a specific container image built out of that code base, then that container image will be pulled from a Docker Hub repository that AWS owns. It is a security thing that we have, and we can't get around that. So the change log, the code, everything is open. It stays in the sub-project under Kubernetes SIG. But if I have to host a container image from that, then I do write the Docker file in the repository, but that artifact will be in the location that AWS permits me to use. Does that make sense?
I mean, it does, but I disagree with the policy, but it does make sense.
It is something that we can't solve.
I would say that it's open to discussion on our side. The policy is around AWS security has some very strong opinions about things that AWS is producing and handing to our customers, that they meet a very high bar for security. If we wanted to change the way those are produced or who's vending those, we may be able to work around it. But I think that's a conversation better had kind of in a different venue than this doc.
I agree on that. And it is a much bigger scope, which honestly, I agree with Stephen's first point. It's kind of difficult it'll push this whole proposal out for, I don't know, gazillion years, even if we try.
Okay.
And I think that's not an abnormal pattern given the, 70 or 80 conformant providers of Kubernetes. I think there are security teams in many of them that have similar concerns about public repositories. We should work to improve the process of building and releasing open source Kubernetes to make it much more secure and trusted. One example is signing pull requests or signing the artifacts that come out of the build and release process, I think would go a long way from our own internal conversations. So we should strive to make that the best in class that there is and meet those security concerns in that way, rather than trying to convince multiple multinational corporations to just believe us.
Yeah, I know that I sign my releases, but you have to, I sign it with my key. So you have to trust that my key, you have to trust me. Yeah. So weird on the internet.
And I think it's not abnormal.
Yeah, and I don't want to drag us too far off topic, but one of the things that we do internally at AWS is we do a security review on all the code we open source or that we contribute to open source. So our security team does get involved. Part of helping build that trust might actually be to have a good, solid, kind of documented process for how the community treats security reviews and what we do around that.
Okay, so I'll retract my comment. Recognize that there's a cap out there so that we don't overstep
I just want to move this forward and get it done.
Yeah.
In that spirit, we have to tackle the easiest low-hanging fruits.
Yeah.
So the only action item that's remaining is, I think we have to fix a date with steering committee for the review. And I have Adam and Steve Steve is on the call, so sorry I'm putting you on the hot seat. I need your comments and review on the document. And then Stephen and Fabio, I'll resolve the open comments with you both offline just to get agreement on that before next week. And I think otherwise we have agreement from everyone.
So
Justin, I would agree from your side, but hopefully you don't disagree with me.
I guess my only question is, are we still doing user groups, or how's that? Like, I see them in one place in 6A, but I don't see them elsewhere.
So I mentioned in the doc that, I don't think that the goal of some of the, like a user group. So basically the way we're organizing Kubernetes, the people who own code are subprojects, right? Subprojects report into SIGs and so on and so forth, right? So if we're going to say that by the governance standards, like we can't say that a user group owns code, right? That's only delegated to subprojects. So by default, I think that we should organize the subprojects, and then if people decide as a user group or whatever you want to call the group, they don't want to own code within the Kubernetes, they should not be. They should be fine to organize as a user group or whatever group they decide to organize as. But as the second they own code, they're subprojects.
Yeah.
Sure. I'm just trying to figure out where what we do with the SIGs that have both functionalities today.
There is nothing like that, and I went and double checked what the user group definition is. So I agree with Stephen that you can't own any code. And also there's another problem that user groups have still not been conceptualized. So there's a lot of work to be done in order to even get that going. this process gets us to the end goal and really doesn't change anything that we're doing. So I do think that the word user group versus sub-projects, we're just getting into the nitty-gritty of it, and we should just move forward with the way it is structured right now.
I mean, I guess my view is that like SIG AWS has two collections within it, two sets within it. There is a group that will naturally identify with the AWS sub-project, the coding type one. And there is there's another group that would prefer to end up in the AWS user group. And we should try to give continuity. And I think if we don't have a user group ready, then we can push on user groups or keep SIG AWS and say we will rename it to a user group, or I don't know.
So what's the focus of the user group? Like what purpose is that serving? Because because technically that user, like while they may organize currently, they don't technically exist within the concept of governance in Kubernetes, right? So if they're going to organize somewhere, they're organizing under either the SIG or the sub-project, right? So
this does predate the governance, so I don't think that's entirely fair to say that the governance, I think if we were to point fingers, I think the fingers should point at the governance.
No, that's totally fair.
I mean, I think that these are people, I think, that are not necessarily as interested in sort of steering committee issues or coding issues, but are more interested in running Kubernetes on AWS, and I don't think we should leave them homeless.
Yeah, but I don't think we are saying that we're leaving them homeless. They're covered in the scope of the existing SIG AWS user group. We continue having bi-weekly meetings. We continue having our Slack channel. Nothing changes. We're just renaming stuff. And we're making it easy for the folks who actually work in the entry release team or the steering committee to have lesser things to worry about. We're actually not saying that the user group is removed at all.
Right. The user group just
using the word user group.
Yeah, so the user group just functionally operates under SIG AWS as it is. And I think like for SIG Azure, it's kind of the same, right? A bunch of the Microsoft people hang out in the Azure channel and just organize there because they don't have an official venue to do that, right? So I was like, come on in, hang out in the channel. There's like, I would want to understand a little bit better like what the purpose of the user group is.
So I can take a swing at that, and then I think other existing SIGs that are provider specific can jump in. Some of the benefits we talked about in previous SIG cloud provider discussions that we want to maintain for those groups are things like the Slack channels, the sessions at KubeCon, the ability to be a speaker at KubeCon and get rooms and so on. And this set of people that Justin is describing, being homeless, is essentially about those types of benefits.
Yeah,
up to now was to reach out to those SIG leads and determine what are the benefits they get out of being a SIG today, and then coordinate with the CNCF to see if we can address those benefits and keep them for the end users that ultimately make Kubernetes successful or not.
So I don't think we lose those benefits by changing what we are right now.
We explicitly do lose the SIG deep dive and intro for SIG AWS is an example.
Yeah, but we're saying that we will have a CNCF user group discussion for AWS users. But it is a problem because user groups today do not allow any code to be published. And if we have to publish the code, then we need some place to host them.
Right. So I guess I'm confused why we need both a sub-project and a user group. Like if we have if the sub-project, I mean, are they essentially the same thing? Because that's what the SIGs cover right now for the particular use cases.
Sorry, Justin, just one more comment and then I'll let you talk. The user group, I think, as written, is intended for the contributors to the code that runs in that cloud provider. And the user group is for the end users who run their own workloads on that cloud provider and have some kind of issue. They're looking for guidance. They've hit a bug. So they're two different profile of user. And what we're trying to distinguish here is, or what we're trying to discuss here is, are all the needs of both of those groups met with the current proposal? It sounds like we have the user group, the contributors part settled, and we have a promise to flesh out the answer for the user group, but not consensus that it's satisfactory the way it is today.
So why can't it cover both? Is I guess what I'm asking, because a lot of time these things are linked together, that there are developers who are consumers of the provider code, and there are also just users who want to run things. And right now that's captured as the umbrella, like SIG OpenStack or SIG AWS captures everybody in that group. So why would a user group not capture that entire set with the recognition that there are two distinct?
I think what's missing here is the concrete criteria to qualify for a user group. You need this many users, and right now we have what this SIG has always tried to chip away at is multiple classes of providers, ones that have essentially showed up on time to get SIG status and so now have Slack channels and KubeCon space, and ones that showed up later or don't have quite as many users, but we don't have clear guidance for what are the concrete criteria to qualify for a KubeCon intro and deep dive, to qualify for a speaker pass to KubeCon, to qualify for a Slack channel and a GitHub notifications and so on and so forth. And that's what we're missing, I think.
So that qualification of what allows a provider group to qualify for a slot and a Slack channel, we can write that and address that. But I also want to say that the sub-projects and the code that we have written and whatever releases we are doing, I can speak for AWS, has been very clearly based on customer feedback and the end user feedback. So to Chris's point, today, the end user and the contributor user both are sitting under the same Slack channel, the Zoom channel. And in fact, having them together is a huge benefit because you get both user feedback and you also get developers who are trying to work with something and that doesn't work. I just think that if we keep them together and we add the qualification of who else can be considered by CNCF to organize these groups, if you will, that should complete the proposal.
So I think that this is another scope creepy thing right here. It's not our job to define what a user group is. That's the job of steering, right? So if we have opinions on what that should be, we should document those opinions and present them to steering. But I think it's separate from this proposal.
Sure.
I think that like the avenues that we have to communicate, I think we're all saying that we're still going to maintain those. So we should continue to do that. And while we put it on steering to fully define what a user group is, and then decide if we need to bring that into what SIG Cloud Provider does as well.
I'm not sure I totally agree, only because of past experience trying to ask steering committee to answer difficult questions. What I have found is typically they delegate that to the most appropriate SIG, which in this case would be the SIG Cloud Provider, which is made up of the folks who are also leads on the specific cloud provider SIGs.
So I disagree that SIG Cloud Provider is the most appropriate one if we're talking about user groups on the whole for Kubernetes. Like that's not SIG Cloud Provider's job. Provider specific user groups, yes, maybe.
And those are ones that we are trying to demote from being SIGs to being sub-projects, and where we've gotten friction. So that's what inspired this reaching out to individual SIG leads to figure out what are the benefits that you are trying to maintain. It's an open, honest conversation. It's not a fight or anything. It's just trying to get information so that we can maintain those benefits.
So why don't we write a proposal and then we offer it to steering committee?
Yeah, so I think the only thing missing, as you pointed out, Nishi, is just what are the criteria for, I don't know, what is an example of one that doesn't have
qualified as a sub-project.
Yeah, I think that's
and we can head it as suggestion, input needed from steering committee.
Can we just
Sorry, Fabio, go ahead.
can we just make this a binding proposal for steering committee? So we do propose to fall down all the SIGs, which is something that steering has been wanting to do for a long time. In return, what we get is we get a clear definition of what a user group is.
So again, I don't think that we should tie this proposal to that. Like that's what's going to hold this proposal up.
But maybe that's how we make progress on user groups, right?
Exactly, because if you want to get something done, then you have to have some leverage, and this would be our leverage. This is something that steering wants to be done, and user group is something that all the other cloud providers SIGs want to be done. So why not use this?
Yeah, so I'm not disagreeing. I'm just trying to calculate the value of getting the consolidation done over holding it to get user groups.
Well, we can certainly move the code. Like, at least from my perspective, I don't think I imagine what we currently call SIG AWS would be, I guess, Stephen, the sort of water cooler, the cool space. I think that sounds great, right? So user group AWS or AWS users on Slack, and I'm less concerned about the slots at KubeCon, except that users seem to ask for them and seem to be surprised when they aren't there, and they tend to be quite well attended, but we can figure that out. And moving the code ownership, I think, is mostly a bureaucratic or like a organizational thing that doesn't have a lot of impact to any users. So I don't think users are going to care whether someone reports to SIG 1 or SIG 2. And so we leave SIG AWS until the user group can replace it.
Some of us have done that already. I mean, I know for a fact cloud provider vSphere is already under SIG Cloud Provider as a code, as a sub-project. So this can be done without like any user noticing. This can be done right away. I guess in all those sessions for Shanghai and Barcelona already, CFP is closed, so they're done. So this is something that will eventually affect, KubeCon North America. So the timeline is not that short. And if we use this, as a way to get clear definition of user group done, I think we should go for it.
I don't think Shanghai is closed yet. I thought Shanghai closed on March 1st for SIGs.
Shanghai is right about to close. Yeah, it's close to closing. So the reason I suggested that is I know that it's close to closing, and by the time this proposal is done, it will probably be closed.
It'll be closed, and that's not to say that there's still. I mean, Barcelona is set in stone. But Shanghai is going to take time for them to finalize the schedule, and so I think it is possible, collaborating with the steering committee and the CNCF, to incorporate some of these changes into the schedule. My recommendation is that for anybody who is not a SIG, I would submit anyway. In case the steering committee wants to take action on this seriously, because the way stay ahead of the game and be engaged, and and I would advocate for that on the principle of fairness.
So one thing to delineate there is the request for proposals over the request for submissions for the maintainer track, right? Those are two separate emails that go out, and two separate audiences, right? So people who want to organize around providers, they won't even have the opportunity to see that email, because that only gets sent to SIG leads, right? So that's something to consider as well.
Okay.
I think we should treat Shanghai as done for this specific proposal.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah, and sorry, I am going to push back a little bit. I put in a lot of effort to get it to this level. I do think that we should continue down this path and maybe rename the Slack channel the way we want to indicate to users that it's both friendly for contributors and end users. That's not a problem. And Justin, wherever you want to make that suggestion, just go through the doc and put it. But I don't think we should stop right now and hold this proposal up because we want to figure out exactly how user groups should be defined.
Well, I'm not disagreeing with you. What I'm saying is that we have a leverage, and if we're not using it this time, we're not going to have it next time.
I don't think we actually need leverage. If it's really about the KubeCon slots, I think Dan Kahn will be perfectly open and willing to make sure that the attendees of KubeCon get what they're there for.
Yeah.
I'm not actually talking about that. I'm not even considering that as a. I think actually from the proposal, the demarcation line between who can present and can propose something that has to do with the cloud provider is actually very well done, and it makes sense. So basically every sub project gets a potential session at KubeCon. It makes perfect sense. Actually, I put a comment asking if this is something that can be replicated for other umbrella SIGs like SIG Cluster Lifecycle, where they have cluster API providers for every provider, very similarly to what we have here. I think this is more like if user groups is something that has to be done because we have users, and Nisha, you were speaking about that before. Users in the feedback loop from end users into the cloud provider and other vendor specific thing that we do in Kubernetes is extremely helpful. So it's not something we want to see gone, and it's something that we actually want to foster with users. So we want to tell them, hey, there's a user group that you can join and you can do the same things that you were doing before, and it's actually a proper organization of users for support and all the other things.
Yeah. So I agree there. I think that I would almost want to discourage multiple groups organizing around the same effort. Like I think that developers and contributors to Kubernetes are still users as well, and there's a point to be made for having everyone organized in the right place.
But then we go back to the SIG. So we had SIGs before where we had that, and we want to get away from SIG. So now we have two groups. Well, actually, we have one group now. We have user groups, and we have sub-projects for a different SIG. So I think it makes sense from an organizational perspective. We just have to have both to actually make it happen.
So to put a finer point on it, I don't think we're trying to get rid of SIGs. I think what we're trying to do is build consistency around the way we develop for every provider, right? So it's not like we're not getting rid of a SIG. We're just saying that we should all organize in the same way.
Well,
right?
we are getting rid of SIGs actually. I mean, that is actually SIG sprawl is one of the goals of eliminating SIG sprawl, so that everybody who wants to show up doesn't get their own SIG, and there are a few more limitations on the expectation to be part of the cloud provider or to have the user group. And so I would disagree that saying, oh, we're not getting rid of SIGs, because that's actually the entire purpose of this.
Well, the purpose is to decrease SIG sprawl, right? And also provide a consistent framework for doing this in the first place, right? The end effect is that we're getting rid of SIGs, but it's not because the SIGs were a bad idea in the first place. It's because they weren't organizing consistently, right? So we're trying to fix that, right? The result of that is getting rid of SIGs, but it's not like the strict reason we're doing it in the first place.
We are not getting rid of the user groups though. I'm not talking about the new user group definition in governance. We're not getting rid of users. That includes two personas, developers as well as the end users who want a use case. They'll all have the same forums. We just rename the Slack channel, reorganize the sub-projects and the labeling.
Okay. So
honestly, why should we waste any more time doing this?
Okay.
I don't see the logic.
So I don't want to stop good discussion that's going on, but I also want to make sure that we still have two topics left in the last 10 minutes. And so I guess where I want to steer the discussion right now is, I know that Nishi wanted to schedule this to go to the steering committee. Do we feel like we are ready to go to the steering committee within the next 2 weeks and start trying to get on the schedule, or do we want to revisit this at our next meeting? Because there's a lot of discussion here.
I think this personally, I think this is close to being ready. I have questions around the way that we give quarterly updates. Initially, there was it's changed now. It's an umbrella update. But I think Chris, you mentioned that we should have extra time, right? So I think that in the slots when we do umbrella cloud provider updates, they should be the entirety of the update block, right? So you give an opportunity for as many people to go as possible, and you just get one update block out of the way a quarter. The other question I had was around the consistency of naming. So I made some suggestions there, and I think other people have too. I think if we can land on naming, that's probably the, like, if we can bike shed on naming a little bit, I think that's the thing that will get us out the door.
Got it, got it.
Everything else looks great.
And Fabio and Steven, I'll just ping you offline to get the naming right. Because as long as we name it right and everybody knows it's all for developers and end users, I think it'll help us out.
I think provider-provider, the name of the provider, gets us there, because then we can use the SIG labels. We can use the way we use SIG labels right now. It can just be provider / whatever the provider name is, right? And that captures that. We rename the existing labels. We rename the Slack channels to provider - blah. It doesn't include cloud, so there's less of this feeling that it's just cloud specific. That's my suggestion, and I've already put it on the doc. So it's really to other people to discuss now.
Yeah.
And
Let's
okay.
talk about offline. And by the way, one quick question. Currently, the community slot for every SIG is how long? Is it 15 minutes, or does anyone remember?
I think it's like 10 minutes or something like that.
Okay. So we would want...
We'd want the full 30.
30 minutes, yeah.
And then Nishi, if you and I can just catch up offline and maybe come up with a straw person proposal for criteria for becoming
qualification of future providers.
I can volunteer to reach out to Dan Kahn and explore and at least come up with a provisional, this sounds generally the right direction around the KubeCon support, and maybe Sarah Novotny or Paris about the infrastructure support for those user groups. And I think that would make me feel more comfortable that there's some concrete criteria.
Yep.
Great. I started the conversation with Dan offline, so I'll add him to the thread.
Okay, thanks.
Diego, I wanted to add one last thing onto that too, since you may be talking with Paris and Dan about this, is we also might want to separate time for developers and move that more into the developer track of the conferences, and time for the users and move that more into the conference track. It's just something to think about. Since there is developer time allocated and there is more conference time allocated, might be useful to consider. But we should also put a pin in this for now, and maybe move on to the last two topics, since we only have about 7 minutes left. Does that sound good to everybody?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I will send an email out to everyone just to get an update, and hopefully next week we can schedule a steering committee.
Okay.
Thank you so much for all your work on this, Nishi, especially.
Yeah, the document looks great.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so Andrew, GAing cloud provider labels on nodes and volumes.
Yeah, so I know we're running out of time, so I'll be super quick. When we register nodes and volumes in Kubernetes, we label them with an instance type and zone and region label. So these were added I think 3 years ago or something like that. And we prefix the label names with beta dot because at the time we didn't know what we wanted to do with them. I don't think we're going to remove these anytime soon, so I'm proposing that we just GA them. There's discussion in the KEP PR to rename the labels to something like topology.kubernetes.io/ zone region, whatever. So this is something that probably needs a consensus from the SIG to go forward with this. Does anyone object to GAing these labels? Or does anyone have better ideas? Well, if you have better ideas for what the label name should be, definitely comment in the PR. But generally, I'd like to get consensus on if we're okay with at least GAing the labels for now. Naming we could deal with later.
As you point out, they've been in flight for so long, it's hard to imagine that they're not treated as BA already. So
yeah. Cool. All right. I'll take that as a thumbs up then.
Yeah, so the only thing I would note is pull SIG node and SIG storage into the conversation as well.
Yep. So I already got approval from SIG node. I will be going to the next SIG storage meeting to get their thumbs up too.
Okay.
It looks like Tim Hawken has some concerns around failure domain. I don't know whether we have addressed that, but.
Yeah, he wanted to rename failure domain to topology to keep it more generic and less so specific to making it less cloud specific. So right now we're settling on topology and failure domain, but we'll see how that goes.
My understanding is that it's about not having a CAN structure more than the name of the thing. So like having more than 2 levels, for example.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So let's continue that. We're running out of time, so let's continue that in the PR. Can you comment on the PR if you have thoughts on that, or if you want to add to that? Or I'll also follow up with Tim, make sure he's okay with the changes we're proposing there.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, thanks, Andrew. For the last 4 minutes, KubeCon Shanghai, the deadline is coming up for us to submit SIG updates. So I was going to put that proposal together. But a few questions. First of all, who can go? We're wondering who might be at Shanghai. I know that it's a little bit of a different event that has a little bit of less attendance from people in North America and in Europe. I'm planning on being there, so I'll be able to help facilitate some of the SIG updates. Jago and Andrew, I don't know if either of you plan on being there for the event.
I don't think I'm going to make Shanghai, no.
Okay.
TBD on my end. But Stephen Wong from VMware said he's likely going, and he would be happy to volunteer to help with any of the sessions.
Okay, fantastic.
So, yeah.
And if anyone else is planning on going too and they want to volunteer on that, get me your names and I'll add that to the proposals. The other thing is what sort of updates do we want to do? Typically, we have a choice of one short update, which is either a deep dive or a general update. We can take 2 short. One would be deep dive. One would be a SIG update, or consolidating the 2 sessions into one long session. And I'm wondering if there's a preference amongst the SIG over which of those 3 options we do. I typically prefer the long update, but I don't know if anyone else had any opinions on that before I submitted the proposal.
So I usually prefer 2 short ones. Gives an opportunity to get more of an audience around 2 different topics. But that's what I'm planning on doing for Azure, but whatever.
So I think the SIG AWS update worked really well last time. Justin, you can jump in here. But we did the demos for each of the sub-projects that we alpha and are going to alpha. And then we took questions from users. And ever since we did that update and we did the release notes, there's been tremendous activity in the SIG AWS community. So that's and it's around the sub-projects that we demoed and worked really well for us. Because it's basically talking about the use case, how can you integrate, storage or KMS plugin or the ALB, and it was actually well received. So that might be something useful to focus.
Okay. As a demo of the things that we're doing, but do you think that's better off as 1 or 2 or?
Sorry, repeat that, Chris.
Was that better as like a single extended update, or is separated amongst the general update and the deep dive?
Yeah, I think it's the general update, shorter session.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone else have any really strong opinions on that and I'll connect with Steven too. And does anybody else is planning on going and want to help deliver any of these? Okay, going once, twice. Well, reach out to me if you're interested, and I'll connect with Steven and see what his feelings are. And if someone else wants to participate, maybe we'll break it up into 2. Otherwise, whatever Steven feels best about, we'll plan on doing. Since there's this no one aside from Steven feels strong about it either way. And with that, I think we're at the end of our hour. Are there any other final business before we close the meeting? Okay. Thanks for joining, everybody. And we'll see you at the next one and in the Slack channel.
Thanks, everyone.